Hi folks, I hope all of you are doing well. In this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about counterarguments, or as I like to think of it, the art of rhetorical self-defense. Now, even though I've probably used these terms intermittently when grading your essays throughout this point in the course, before I go too far into this lecture, I want to make sure that you have a perfectly good understanding of how I use these terms and what they mean. So first off, the one term that I'm going to be using a lot is a counterargument. Now, a counterargument, by definition, is an opposing argument about a given topic. So, whatever your thesis statement is, a counterargument is an argument from an opposing point of view, an opposing source, that in some way contrasts your views on that particular topic. Now, very often when you write more complex academic essays, particularly argumentative essays, you're not going to find sort of black and white opposition to your argument. There are some topics that are like that, such as abortion or gun control. Issues like that, you're either staunchly pro-choice or staunchly pro-life. You're either wholeheartedly for gun control and, tighter access to guns, or you're wholeheartedly against it. So those are a couple exceptions to the rule, but having said that, most arguments that you're going to encounter and that you're going to write about during your academic career are not arguments that strictly oppose each other. More often, instead, it's going to be a question of finding nuances and subtle differences in how someone looks at a topic versus how you approach it. So, for instance, if you were to write a paper about global warming and how to best deal with that issue, you might advance the idea that the best way to deal with it would be to reduce the amount of cars that run on standard gasoline. An opposing source might acknowledge that as a possibility, but put more emphasis instead on the generation and use of solar power. So again, when we talk about counterarguments and when you're looking for counterarguments, don't think that you necessarily have to find one that will, be directly and staunchly opposed to your thesis statement, because more often than not, you're not going to find that kind of strong opposition. It's going to be more a question of nuance and finding the subtle differences between arguments and positions. Going on to the next term, though, a refusal is an argument made to disprove a counterargument. In other words, after you've acknowledged a counterargument, the refusal is evidence that you then provide to show why your ideas, why your thesis is better, more logically sound than that particular counter-argument that you're dealing with. So these are the key terms. Keep them in mind as I show you the forthcoming models for dealing with counter-arguments. Now, before I even get to the models, I want to mention that when you look at them, don't think that these are the only ways that you can kind of weave counter-arguments into your papers. These are just the suggestions that I offer that tend to have been based on my observations and teaching practices, the more successful strategies that students have used over the years. But again, don't think that these are necessarily the only strategies that would work. So, moving forward, here's the first model. I want to emphasize first that much of this content should be very familiar to you, and that you should already know that you start out with an introduction and thesis. Usually, paragraphs, sometimes more, but, that's usually your first step. And then after that, you want to make observations on whatever text you're writing about. That's, again, another word for that might be just a sort of passive summary of the text. So before you begin to judge that text and analyze it, the observation phase, as many of you have already done in your essays, is simply where you let the reader know what that text is about, what it's saying, the ideas that it is advancing, if you will. Now, where it starts to get a little different is in that third step, the lump counterargument. And what I mean by that is when you write an essay of standard length for a college level course, and for our purposes, standard length can be anywhere from 3 to 9 pages. So it's kind of a broad definition, but that's kind of the range of papers in terms of length that you're going to have to write during most of your academic career. So the lump refusal is where you describe however many counter-arguments that you want to deal with. Just describe them one after the other. And then when you're done describing them, the lump refusal is where you then work at refuting those counter-arguments in the order that you listed them above. And that's really the key point if you use this method. If you do a lump refusal, you want to make sure that you refute the counter-arguments that you had talked about in the third step, in the order that you originally listed them. It might seem like a small detail, might seem like a bit of nitpicking on my part, but trust me, folks, it is really a pivotal detail that you refute those counter-arguments in the order that you originally listed them. The other thing that I want to say real quickly before I move forward is that, when we talk about these parts here, excluding probably the intro and thesis and the conclusion at the end, even though I'm listing these points as just one point on an outline, don't think that you need to use just one paragraph necessarily for your lump counter-arguments, or one paragraph for the lump refusal. Often that's going to be multiple paragraphs. So, and same for the analysis, that's usually going to be more than one paragraph. But after you're done with the lump refusal, then the analysis is really where you just focus a bit more intensely, if you will, on proving your ideas. So you've acknowledged the counter-arguments, you've dealt with them, and then before you close out the essay, again, you focus more intensely on showing why your ideas are the more valid ones that you're dealing with. So that's the analysis part, and then the conclusion. We've already gone over that, so I'm not gonna dwell on that here, and I trust that, you folks know how to handle that, so we'll move on to the next model. In this model, again, notice that the first step starts out just as you would normally expect: introduction, thesis, followed by the observations. Where this model differs, of course, is that instead of writing about all of the counterarguments in one shot, you would describe one counterargument, refute it, move to the next, describe the next one, refute it, so on and so forth, until you're completely done with the counterargument and refusal phases, and then move again more exclusively toward your analysis and the conclusion. So again, this is another perfectly appropriate model to use. What I will say, however, is if you're not feeling very confident in your ability to kind of weave counterarguments into a paper, you might want to use that other model that I showed you a moment ago, simply because there are fewer steps that you have to follow, and by extension, fewer opportunities for you as the writer to kind of lose your way with the flow of ideas on that paper. So again, these are both perfectly valid approaches, but the other one perhaps a little simpler to execute because there are fewer steps involved. The other thing that I want to mention about this model is I've seen this model executed in a couple different ways, where a person would take a whole paragraph or more to describe a counterargument and then a paragraph or more to refute that item. That approach can work. I've also seen it done where a student would just take a sentence or two to describe the counterargument and then use the rest of a paragraph, that same paragraph, to refute it. That approach can work as well. I'm a little bit leery of that approach because the problem there is sometimes the one of those two components will be lacking when you try to do it all in one paragraph. Either the description of the counterargument or the refusal will be a little lacking in detail. So you can do that, but be aware of that possible drawback to how you might execute this strategy. So, closing up then, some final recommendations, and then I'll let all of you go. Don't let counterarguments overpower your own argument. That's probably the biggest thing that I want you to be aware of. And there are a couple ways that you can do this. The one way that I'll go over with you first is just in terms of volume. For that standard academic essay of 3 to 9 pages, you probably would want to use anywhere between 1 to no more than 3 counterarguments. Obviously, if it's on the shorter end of that spectrum, 3 or 4 pages, 1 would probably be sufficient. If it was a longer paper, you could probably go 2 or 3, but that's one way that counterarguments can overpower your ideas. The other way is you want to be very careful where you put counterarguments in the flow of your essay. It is okay to briefly describe them in the introduction, but in terms of going into them in detail, you really want to wait for the body and the middle of your paper to do that. As readers of the English language, we're kind of conditioned to believe that a writer is going to focus more intensely on their own ideas in the very beginning and the very end of an essay. So that if you put counterarguments too closely to the very beginning or the very end, there's a chance that the reader could inadvertently believe that you're supporting the counterargument, even if it's otherwise clearly worded that you in fact oppose it. So be very careful about, again, how you position counterarguments and refusals within the overall span of your paper. One mistake that I see students make a lot is that they wait till the very end of a paper to even begin to acknowledge a counterargument, and then they'll use the conclusion as the opportunity to refute it. The conclusion, as we've already talked about, has its own place and its own value within an essay, so you need to deal with counterarguments before you get to that point. So again, be careful about where you put them. And then finally, as always, if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to contact me. I want to help all of you, and I'm always here to help. So until next time, folks, ignore this part here because I know it's not that interesting, but I wish all of you well and take care. Until next time, bye.